Wisdom webinar over the next 60 minutes will explore how you can build high-performing global teams through a foundation of understanding of the unique challenges that global teams face, along with some practical advice that you can incorporate into your daily team interactions. Let's take a look at who's here today. Grayson Lebrance is our primary presenter for today. She is a director and intercultural trainer with RW3 Culture Wizard. As a facilitator, Grayson delivers engaging, interactive learning experiences that leverage her intercultural expertise to build high-performing teams, in addition to helping expatriates achieve success on international assignment. Prior to joining RW3 Culture Wizard, Grayson was part of a global marketing team at Johnson & Johnson. She received her MBA from the University of North Carolina Keenan Flagler Business School and has lived abroad in both Germany and Brazil. My name is Shanta Burke. I'll also be presenting in addition to producing the webinar. I am the Director of Intercultural Training at RW3 Culture Wizard, and in my role, I lead a global network of intercultural trainers and consultants that we partner with to design and deliver learning experiences for our clients. While I am native to California here in the U.S., I've also lived and worked abroad in Germany, Spain, and the UK. A few words about our company, RW3 Culture Wizard. We were founded in 2001 by Charlene Solomon and Michael Schell, who have been involved in global talent development, intercultural training, and global mobility for over 30 years. Culture Wizard is our flagship online learning platform that some of you hopefully know us through and have accessed in the past. We will be discussing a few areas of our online learning platform today. But we serve over 100 global organizations with Culture Wizard in addition to instructor-led learning experiences. And now before we begin, I'd like to briefly familiarize you all with the GoToWebinar platform that we're using today. We do have a large number of callers, so your phones have been muted to reduce background noise. We do want to encourage participation, so you can ask questions at any time using the questions area, which you'll find right there in the GoToWebinar dashboard. There will also be points during the webinar where we will ask you to respond to open-ended questions in addition to polls. So please be sure to respond to those as soon as we project them. And as always, we will make the presentation, in addition to a recording of this webinar, available to you via email next week. All right.
If I could pause you there. This is Grayson. We have a question in the question box asking, has the webinar started? I just wanted to make sure that people are able to hear the audio.
That is a great thing to confirm. So if anyone can write into the question box, tell us that you hear us. And I see a bunch of yeses coming in. That's great.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Thank you for catching that, Grayson, as well. All right. So now that we know that you can hear us, we can continue with confidence. So why are we here today? Today's workplace is truly global and virtual, but what we know from some research that we're going to discuss in a moment is that only about 20% of people receive training to be effective in this environment. I'm sure that many of you are also here because you recognize the diverse ways in which people approach the workplace, from the way people build trust and establish rapport, to the way people communicate information, and how they prefer to be managed, and even how people define success. All of this differs from person to person and from culture to culture. So our goal for this session is to define and understand high performance, in addition to the unique challenges that global teams face, and to leverage that knowledge towards building skills and strategies for success on teams that are distant both culturally and physically. So the central question that we'd like you to consider moving forward is, how can we make distance and cultural diversity competitive advantages for our teams? And this is our agenda. Here's how we're going to move towards our goals. We have a 4-part agenda, and we will also strive to leave a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. And with that, I'm going to pass the ball to Grayson to continue.
Great. Thank you, Sean. I am delighted to be here with everyone today to talk about building high-performing global teams. We are going to start off by defining high performance and then go into identifying key challenges to virtual team success. From there, we will explore virtual challenges through a cultural lens, and finally share some tools to help you and your global teams to succeed. So let's start off by thinking about what it means to be a high-performing team. If everyone could go to the question box and type in your definition of a high-performing team, the first words that pop to mind, we would love to hear. You have some answers coming in. I see collaborative, efficient, exceeding metrics, delivering results, new ideas and diversity. Lots of great answers coming in. When I began researching high-performing teams, one of the most interesting things was that what people thought were characteristics of high-performing teams often were actually definitions of effective performance. These are things like open communication, effective problem solving, and measurement. Now, high-performing teams have all of these attributes that you see on the left-hand side of your screen, combined with a few unique attributes. Things like high-performing teams have higher levels of camaraderie, so people that truly like being around one another, both at work and in their personal lives. High-performing teams demonstrate increased levels of interdependence, people that can easily shift roles and responsibilities to cover for one another if someone has to miss work or just needs a little help along the way. High-performing teams demonstrate greater collective learning and adaptive capabilities, so you actually learn better as part of your group. And then closer identification with team outcomes and belief in the impossible. I once used this slide in a presentation with a manufacturing client. I had the opportunity to present just after the president. And in his presentation, the president was saying that the corporate goal for sales for 2014 was $4 billion. And then he looked at the team and he said, but I don't see why we can't do 6. So you'll see with this belief in what to some might seem like an impossible goal, in this case, it was the president of the organization pushing his team towards high performance. When you think through all of the characteristics of a high-performing team and start to really zero in on the keys to high performance really live in a common purpose, trust, and communication. At the intersection of these 3 attributes lies high performance. And with that definition of high performance in mind, let's look at the key challenges that global teams face. Let's start with a poll. What is the biggest challenge you face on your global team? So Sean is activating the poll now. The choices we have are decision-making, differing expectations, language, accents, people not participating, scheduling, and time zones. We have the answers coming in now.
All right, Grayson, we've got around 75%, almost 80% now that have voted, so I'll go ahead and close and share the results for you.
Great. Thank you, Sean. So interesting results. You'll see people not participating is a large challenge. Differing expectations actually shows up as the highest challenge in the group today. We've got scheduling and time zones, decision-making, and language and accents showing a smaller amount of challenge for people in the room today. As Sean mentioned in the introduction, we are here today because global work is virtual work. Every other year, RW3 conducts a large survey of about 3,000 global professionals in over 100 countries to better understand global and virtual teams. In 2014, we discovered a number of challenges that we're going to look at today. In general, the data tells us that it is far more challenging to be high-performing on a global team in comparison to teams that are co-located. The most consistent theme we see in our research and with our clients is time zones. 83% of respondents call time zones a challenge. We all know what it's like to try to schedule a call that works for everyone around the world, or to be the person who takes the call at 5 a.m. or 10 p.m. when you're not quite at your best. Likewise, in our research, language showed up as a consistent challenge, specifically understanding accents, which 72% of respondents identified with. It's harder to understand people when you can't see them, and gets even more challenging when you face technical issues like phone delays. When we look at the most severe virtual challenges, we saw colleagues who do not participate at 80%, so mirroring what we saw in our poll together today. The pace and process of decision-making at 76% and 75% respectively, and differing role expectations of team members at 71%. And I have to say that my experiences with clients support this data. These are challenges that we work on every day. So far, we have defined high performance and identified the top challenges facing global teams. Now let's take a look at those challenges through a cultural lens to discover some of the things that drive them. People are a product of their cultures, national, personal, and organizational. When we walk into a room, we view interactions through our cultural lens. We pass cues through our filters and then decide how to react. It's important to remember that a person is likely to seriously misinterpret situations in other cultures if they view them solely in terms of their own lens, their own values, expectations, and behaviors. Stephen Covey put it beautifully when he said, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it." When we teach culture, we introduce people to the intercultural awareness, or ICAM model. This model gives you a new cultural lens, a way to read recognizable behaviors and figure out how to adapt your behavior for greater success. The first step is awareness. Awareness that differences exist, awareness of your own preferences, and awareness of how to determine preferences on your global team. People want to do a good job. Most people come to work with a drive to participate and to succeed. Sometimes they just need a little help to make that happen, especially on global teams. Using the cultural lens, we help people understand that culture affects the way people approach work, how they demonstrate commitment and collegiality, and even how they define high performance. To help to bring the ICAM model to life, here are 6 of the 8 dimensions. The dimensions are those recognizable behaviors that you can identify and adapt your approach accordingly. The dimensions manifest on a spectrum. There is no right or wrong, just different ways that people approach work. You'll see here now where a handful of cultures fall on the cultural dimensions. Now we're going to take a look at the key challenges to global virtual teams through this ICAM lens. Beginning with colleagues who do not participate. There are several reasons people don't participate on their global teams. People don't participate because they don't feel empowered to disagree. They don't feel prepared, and sometimes they don't have the opportunity to contribute. The hierarchy dimension speaks to a person's feelings of empowerment and willingness to disagree. On the egalitarian side of the spectrum, people tend to value self-initiative. They see people as equals across levels and functions and feel empowered to speak up, to act, and to disagree. On the hierarchical side of the spectrum, people tend to value rank and role. They are often very respectful of authority and do not feel comfortable disagreeing, especially in a public setting. On the hierarchical spectrum, you'll see the USA as being highly egalitarian. Then we've got Hungary and the United Kingdom in the middle. And then we've got Kenya, Mexico, and China as leaning towards being more hierarchical. The communication dimension looks at how individuals contribute and how comfortable they are with different modes of communication. On the direct side of the spectrum, people focus on clear, concise messages. They use very little nuance or nonverbal. They are comfortable contributing across mediums and often prefer electronic communication because they can keep it short. On the indirect side, people communicate with more nuance. They are careful with their word choice and use nonverbals, including silence, to communicate. Oftentimes, indirect communicators need time to prepare their contributions, especially if they're speaking in a language that is not their first. You'll see that Americans rate as being direct. I work with many people in indirect cultures that have asked me how to better participate on their virtual teams when the Americans won't stop talking. From there, you'll see Hungary, Kenya, and the UK right in the middle, and then we've got China and Mexico leaning towards being more indirect. Now that we understand some of the causes of lack of participation, what can we do about it? As leaders, we can create a safe space for contributions and disagreement. In working with hierarchical team members, simply having this permission can make all the difference. Creating a safe space can be verbal, where the leader says it up front at the beginning of conference calls. Leaders can also create a safe space by opening channels of communication, like allowing people to contribute thoughts before and after meetings via email or in one-on-one discussions. You can encourage opposing views by asking people to provide counterpoints and ask what if. This can not only increase contributions, but also mitigate risk and encourage creativity. To increase participation, we always recommend providing detailed agendas with discussion points and decision points a couple of days prior to a meeting, or 24 hours at best. This gives indirect communicators time to prepare. And once in the meeting, it's always a good idea to allow for silence, to give indirect people a chance to begin speaking. And if you're still not hearing from everyone, oftentimes asking directly yields great results. So with that in mind, I'd love now to hear from you. So what would you add? How do you encourage participation on your global teams? If you could go to the questions box and start to share some best practices, that would be wonderful. Okay, we have some answers coming in. Kathy is saying an icebreaker in the beginning. Excellent, great idea. Give everyone a role from Marguerite. Nayana encourages having one-on-ones. Barry encourages having a moderator. Deborah likes to get to know team members. Danielle says simply ask them. Nozomi says, in quotes, don't blame culture. So thinking about people's personal preferences for communication, making them feel comfortable contributing. Gianna says meeting 5 minutes before to start to build rapport. Fantastic answers. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. The next challenge that we're going to look at is the pace and process of decision making. Some team members might feel that it takes forever to make a decision, while others might feel rushed. This can happen because of different expectations around building trust and completing due diligence. The relationships dimension impacts decision making. The spectrum ranges from transactional to interpersonal. On the transactional side of the spectrum, people tend to trust you automatically because you're part of the team. They figure if you're good enough to be there, you're good enough to work with them. On the interpersonal side of the spectrum, people tend to need to get to know you before they trust you. They need to build trust through an understanding of your background and competence. This pace of building trust directly contributes to the pace of decision making. You'll see here on the relationship scale, we have Americans at rating as highly transactional, We have Hungary and the UK right in the middle. Then we have Mexico leaning towards more interpersonal, China and Kenya as being highly interpersonal. The group spectrum also impacts decision making. The spectrum ranges from individual to group. On the individual side, people are motivated by individual achievements, while on the group side, people are motivated by the success of the team. From a decision-making standpoint, people with an individual focus tend to look for experts for decisions, while people with a group orientation seek consensus. The due diligence involved in building consensus versus deferring to experts looks vastly different from both a pace and process perspective. To overcome decision-making challenges, you can first learn how decisions are made in your colleagues' cultures. And Sean has a great story that I would love for him to add. It's about decision-making in Japan.
Definitely, Grayson, thank you. So in Japanese business, there is a unique word for the typical way of reaching decisions or even proposing new ideas, and the word is nemawashi. It's not easy to translate directly, but it is a kind of informal way of building a consensus using one-on-one discussions with each member of a decision-making group. And it's usually conducted prior to a formal meeting. So the debate that typically leads to decisions in Western groups doesn't happen in formal meetings in Japan. So nemawashi can also take some time. Folks who aren't familiar with this approach are usually not effective making decisions with Japanese. So we wanted to include this example to show you a pretty stark contrast between decision-making styles.
Great. Thank you, Sean. You can also define a decision-making process. One of my clients recently implemented Bain's RAPID, so it's R-A-P-I-D, decision-making process, and they told me that they are seeing great success with it. You can also set a deadline. This will give people time to build trust and complete due diligence as necessary, while keeping the pace moving toward a clear goal. Let's go back to you now. I'd love to hear what you have to add. How do you drive to decisions on your global teams? And if you have other decision-making processes, like the RAPID process, to recommend to the group, it would be great to hear those as well. Got some answers coming in. Ninu says polling. Maurice has recording all decisions. Paul is recommending both rapid and agile, A-G-I-L-E, decision-making processes. Ebenezer says build consensus. Sean, as a presenter, I am seeing some of the answers as the first couple of words, and I don't see the end of the sentences. If you're seeing some interesting things that I'm not reading out, would you please jump in and share them?
Definitely.
Great.
I see.
Thank you.
Yep.
Perfect. So I've got Richard saying acquiring buy-in. Oh, and Rocky has an interesting one, creating a decision tree. Great. Thank you for that. The last challenge we are going to look at today is differing role expectations. People have different expectations of leadership, accountability, and work input. The hierarchy dimension looks at whether people expect to be directed or coached. Often in hierarchical cultures, leaders are expected to have all the answers and to clearly define what needs to be done, how to do it, and when it's due. On the egalitarian side of the spectrum, it can be okay for a leader to say, I don't know, and to ask the group, or ask someone else in order to find out. Egalitarian leaders often act as coaches that outline a goal and provide tools and training, but then ask the employees to determine the best way to complete the work. Likewise, the hierarchy spectrum helps to define accountability. In hierarchical cultures, the leaders are ultimately accountable, which is why they often outline a process step by step. In egalitarian cultures, people tend to feel more ownership and accountability for their own deliverables and adjust their work style accordingly. The group dimension looks at how people expect to contribute. This is one of my favorite things to explain in training sessions. People with a high individual focus like to contribute. People with a high group focus like to collaborate. In the United States, people consider it to be teamwork if each individual on a team completes their specific piece of a project and then one person puts it all together for delivery. In the U.S., that could be considered a solid team. This would never work in a high group culture. In high group cultures, people like to collaborate on each piece of the project and truly believe and deliver that collaboration contributes to a much greater whole. To alleviate some frustration that people could potentially feel from this challenge, you can create a team contract that outlines roles, responsibilities, and expectations for input. And we'll look at this in more detail later. You can practice communication skills that help people align and move forward with confidence. And you can also verify understanding, both verbally and in writing, after meetings. And now, back to you. What would you add? How do you manage expectations on your global team? Got some answers coming in. Nino and Deborah both said team norms. Maurice has a similar answer of defining a team charter. Harold talks about creating common objectives. Anna's mentioning clear communication. Kathy says to agree on team expectations. Kelly is mentioning a playbook with definitions of roles and responsibilities. Richard's talking about being as clear as possible. Fantastic answers coming in. Right start meetings from Danielle, great idea. Jillian is mentioning following up with team members. Andy's mentioning playing to cultural strengths. So lots of ideas around building trust, defining roles and responsibilities, and having people agree and contribute to those team charters and expectations. Great. Thanks for that, everyone. Now we're going to turn our attention to some tools for global team success. We are going to start with the exercise that I mentioned earlier. This is an exercise for building a high-performing team. It is very helpful in creating the team contracts and charters that people are mentioning as a best practice. To set this up, we know that high-performing teams do not make assumptions. They deeply consider individuals and create structure to achieve high performance. The way that this exercise works is you start off by creating a vision for success for the team. So for example, you can visualize how this team will look in 1 year. How will you be communicating? How will you be contributing? And what will you be delivering? So creating a very strong vision for success for the team. And then from there, you look at potential cultural challenges to achieving that vision. Culture Wizard clients can use the Team Place tool on their Culture Wizard site to facilitate conversations around differences on your team. Now, people that are not currently Culture Wizard clients can still facilitate conversations based around today's discussion. You can talk about the challenges from the research and how they manifest on your specific team. You can also talk about how your team likes to work, how the members like to contribute, and how they like to feel successful. And then lastly, we build a bridge to overcome the challenges and realize the success by creating guidelines for high performance. And all of these components combine to become a team contract. To give you some examples of creating guidelines, here are some questions that you can ask, that you can use for creating those guidelines for high performance on your global team. So for hierarchy, things like how will you determine roles and responsibilities? For communication, what will be your team's style? For control, what will be your attitude toward risk? For relationships, how will you establish trust? For group, how will you approach decision making? And for time, how will you define a sense of urgency? Now I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and he is going to talk about building trust, our next tool for global team success.
Thank you, Grayson. So let's look at how we can do that. How can we build trust in a global and oftentimes virtual environment where we don't always get to see each other face to face? I'd like to start with a poll. I'm going to launch that. Please tell us which of these is your team currently doing. And you can choose more than one option here. Go ahead and cast your vote as soon as you can. The options are telling one another if they can't keep a commitment, applying standards for effective interaction, checking for understanding both verbally and in writing, and finally providing feedback in culturally appropriate ways. All right, around half of you have voted. I'll leave this open for another 10, 15 seconds. All right, we've got just over 75%. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results so we can all take a look at how everyone is currently building trust. I've got around 67% of the audience that shows that they check for understanding both verbally and in writing. 52% of teams are communicating when they can't keep a commitment. 35% are providing feedback in culturally appropriate ways. And at the bottom here, 29% are applying standards for effective interaction, which is what we just reviewed with Grayson. All right. Well, what I want to say is that to those of you who chose any of those options, good job. You're already building trust in important ways. All of these are best practices that we advise our clients pursue, in addition to several others that we cover in our trust audit, which you can find on the virtual teams tool on Culture Wizard for those of you who have access to Culture Wizard. But essentially what we see here on this slide is that we build trust with one another by delivering on expectations. But our expectations of one another are informed and defined by our cultural backgrounds. So in an increasingly global and multicultural workplace, the expectations that we set for each other are just as diverse. So it's important to understand that it can be difficult to build trust in a virtual setting without explicitly setting expectations and making very clear that your colleagues and teams understand them. In all of our experience and research, trust continues to serve as the glue that keeps teams in a high-performing state. And without it, teams really don't go beyond effective to high-performing. Trust is a very complex concept because it's important to know that it's earned differently from culture to culture. And what we learned earlier from Grayson is that in the West, most of us are accustomed to building trust through demonstration of our ability to contribute, our technical capabilities, and our overall competence. If I provide high-quality work, my colleagues will trust me. I've often heard friends and colleagues in the U.S. say to me that, I don't need to like or even truly know who my colleagues are in order to work with them. In many other parts of the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, trust is built through development of interpersonal relationships, relationships that are founded in what might appear to be friendship, knowing people for who they are beyond the workplace, spending time with them outside of the office, going to dinners, getting drinks, spending time on the weekends. So for these reasons, trust simply cannot be assumed. On top of that, trust is easily damaged by these kinds of cultural misunderstandings. So essentially, it needs to be established and maintained, especially for global and virtual teams that don't always have face-to-face opportunities to meet. So on this next slide, I'd like to ask you guys the question, how have you built trust on your virtual teams? What other best practices have you developed? Please go ahead and respond to this question in the questions box. We'd love to hear what you've developed. Right here from Mino, do in-depth self-intros at the first team meeting. Really important to talk about who you are, to find commonalities during that first meeting. Really great. From Catherine, shared social experiences, staging team building sessions, whether it's at the office or not. Joanna, sharing photos of important events in your life or simply sharing photos of what you look like to add that human element. Really great. Michael says, have the team identify and help celebrate cultural celebrations of other team members. Really important to get familiar with the customs and traditions that exist from the cultures that are represented on your teams. Kathy suggests utilize videos. Show your face. So I'm thinking about webcams. How many of us are using webcams on a regular basis with our virtual teams? Lydia is telling us to keep promises and don't commit to anything that is not possible or likely to happen. Those disappointments that erode trust can be very difficult to recover from. So avoiding them at all costs is really important. Wonderful examples, and I'm really glad to hear especially the ones that have to do with leveraging technology to collaborate in ways that simulate the face-to-face environment. Really helpful. Thank you all for those. So we wanted to share a few more best practices that we've developed that we think are pretty important. I'm just going to highlight 3 of them here in this slide. The first one is, again, focus on setting those expectations. Remember that over-communicating critical information, bolding information, highlighting information in emails, for example, making sure what you're communicating, those critical items are very clear, or providing additional context and detail. Over-communicating, hyper-communication, usually going to be more effective than it is leaving out details that folks might find very useful. The second one here is choose to use email carefully. Sometimes it's going to be more effective to make a phone call, to send a text message, or an instant message versus sending something in writing via email. You get more from a phone call, for example, instant feedback, than you do from an email. And the communication channels that you use are many, so be careful to choose them for effectiveness and for high performance. And finally, discuss cultural differences. We really encourage you to use culture and value differences as a conversation topic to build trust, to really identify where there may be gaps, but also to find commonalities, to find things that you share, and to use those to build the interpersonal relationships and to work towards integration and ultimately high performance. And with that, I will pass the ball back to Grayson.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Now we are going to look at some additional best practices for global teams. First, manage logistics. Rotate team meeting times to share the time zone burden. As we were mentioning at the beginning of our time together today, this is a consistent theme that we see when working with global and virtual teams, that time zones are always a burden. So make sure that you share the responsibility, that there's not always one team member that's getting up at 5 a.m. Utilize video technology whenever possible. It helps establish rapport, read nonverbal cues, and make accents easier to understand. So as Sean was mentioning, I'm seeing some of this, the technology focus come through in your best practices was fantastic. Number 3 is plan backups for technology failures, like sending people slides in advance of important meetings. This is something that I did to Sean last night at about 9 p.m. I sent him the final slides for our time together today, just in case there was a technology failure on my end. And last, but certainly not least, is to try to see each other in person at least once a year, if possible. As we've mentioned throughout our time together today, encouraging contributions is critical to capitalizing on the diversity of your global team. People need to feel comfortable expressing their unique ideas. So one of the best pieces of advice, so we've mentioned it a couple of times today, is the idea of providing detailed agendas at least 24 hours in advance. These agendas should include both discussion points and decision points. This gives indirect communicators and non-native speakers time to prepare their contributions, and everyone time to think about driving toward a decision. Ask open-ended questions to understand both if and how something is going to happen. This is especially helpful if you are working in cultures that do not like to say no. And create a safe space for people to contribute both before and after meetings. That way, indirect communicators can deliver points to the leader for inclusion in the call, or if they don't get a chance to contribute live, they can follow up after the meeting in writing or one-on-one. Next is practice communicating. When you walk into a room or pick up the phone, remember the cultural lens and be prepared to adapt your approach with team contracts and those guidelines for high performance. Give consideration for non-native speakers by giving them time to prepare and participate. Allow time for silence. At the end of the meeting or conversation, verify understanding, both verbally and in writing, with summary notes. Last, it's important to evaluate your performance. Look at your individual contribution and the success of the team overall. Make it a 360 if you can by getting feedback from senior leaders, colleagues, and direct reports. And after your evaluation, celebrate success and then plan to improve. You can update your team contract on an annual basis as you set your goals. Last, let's look at a couple of Culture Wizard tools to support your global team success. Sean mentioned the Virtual Teams course. The Virtual Teams course is a 1-hour course that can be found in the Culture Wizard Team Effectiveness track. It will provide more depth around what we've covered today, especially it includes the trust audit and goes into significantly more depth around building relationships and really solidifying trust. I mentioned TeamPlace earlier. TeamPlace is a tool that allows you to compare the personal cultural profiles of individual members of your team. So you can go beyond just looking at cultural norms and actually look at personal preferences, which adds a lot of depth and is perfect for facilitating discussions around differences and then creating team contracts and guidelines. You can find that one in the Culture Wizard Team Effectiveness track too. Now, before we move on to questions, I would like to ask everyone for an action step. What is the first thing that you are going to do differently based on what you've learned today? If you could go to the question box and share some action steps, that would be great. The first comment is providing detailed agendas. Thank you. Elja is looking at arranging a face-to-face. Bonnie is looking to learn more about her team members. Ruth is going to start using the webcam more. Anthony and Terry are both on board with detailed agendas. Eula is going to discuss cultural differences. Gian is going to remember the cultural lens. Mino is going to add some norms. Michelle is going to send summaries. Dawn's going to learn some more about the trust, building trust. Kathy's going to apply the ICAM. Richard says stop and think before interacting. Great. And Maurice says something similar, pausing to check and understand. Rachel wants to incorporate some 360 feedback.
Grayson, if I could mention
Gerald's
one
going to
here.
share that. Yeah, great.
I really like one here from Nozomi, which is to really create opportunities to contribute before and after meetings, which is what we advise in our session today. Really important to do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. Lots of great answers here. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we've got about 15 minutes, and we are ready to move into question and answers. So Sean and I are both here to take your questions. And again, you can type those into the question box.
So again, we just want to encourage you to plug in any questions that you have for us that you'd like us to answer on this topic of building high-performing teams, and we will do our best to answer them. Again, the questions box is located in the GoToWebinar dashboard that you've been using.
Great. And Sean, Mino is asking to speak to the role of the team leader.
That is an excellent question. So it's a pretty expansive question, and I think Grayson and I can probably add some value here by describing some best practices around what the team leader can do to build high-performing teams. Now, of course, the idea that a team leader can really influence, inspire, and motivate a group to be high-performing really requires, from my experience, familiarity with a number of orientations that a leader or manager of a group of people that are virtual and global really needs to hone in order to be effective. And one of them is to really learn how to adapt oneself to various styles when it comes to giving feedback, for example, to folks who may be sitting in South Korea one meeting and then giving feedback in a very different way to folks who are sitting in Brazil versus Germany. So being flexible, being open to adjusting your style as a leader is extremely important. Being able to take the perspective of your teammates, those that you're managing or leading, is critical. So again, that first orientation is adaptation, adapting your style. The second would probably be minimizing differences by upholding certain organizational standards. So really leveraging what you understand about the company's culture. As a leader, you can really rally and bring people together to align on a certain purpose, for example, or even if it's just a simple process. If there are any guiding principles or mission statements that the organization or even the department has established, it's a really important and effective way to align your teammates behind a single value or preference or cause. And again, I would call that orientation the idea of minimizing differences by focusing on what the company has said is important to your success. And that third orientation, which goes back to what Grayson reviewed, the Building High-Performing Teams exercise, is this idea of integrating differences. How can you, as a team leader, integrate and have a conversation about integrating and compromising around the variety and diversity of preferences and values that exist on your team? And of course, using the Team Place tool is a really effective way of doing that. You don't need it to facilitate that conversation, but visually, that team profile can really help you see where there are gaps between individuals and yourself. And again, to simply facilitate a conversation around, well, if we have people who are very hierarchical on this team alongside folks who are very egalitarian, how can we make sure that in a group session, because we have group teleconferences, the only way that we can meet as a virtual team, how can we integrate our differences? How can we make sure that we're maximizing contributions from everyone? So as we saw earlier, encourage contributions before and after meetings for folks who are maybe not comfortable speaking up in a group setting, especially when there are various levels attending. That's one example of creating a certain guideline or norm or process that integrates those differences. So again, it's as a leader, it's understanding how to be flexible between adapting your own style, minimizing differences, and also integrating them to become high-performing. And I'm sorry that I went on and on with that one, but Grace, if you have anything to add there, that's kind of my response.
No. Yeah, that was great, Sean. Thank you. You hit on all of the points that I jotted down that I wanted to cover, and you hit on all of them. So thank you for that.
Wonderful.
We have, another question that came in from Rachel on what to do when people don't answer emails. Rachel, this is a very interesting question because, of course, there are a variety of different reasons why people don't answer emails. One of the strongest cultural drivers behind why people don't answer emails is that oftentimes people that you don't hear back from in writing tend to be more interpersonal. And so as a result, they want to build a relationship with you before they prioritize answering you. So oftentimes if you're not hearing back from people when you reach out to them via email, the best thing that you can do is pick up the phone and try to call them and establish some rapport, and then help them to understand your need and the urgency behind it. And try to get the answer right there if you can. And even better, if you have an opportunity to go see them face to face. A lot of times with people who are more interpersonally focused, this can make a big difference when you're trying to get responses. So in general, I would say if people don't answer your emails, that's the first thing that you can do, is try to build a relationship, establish some rapport, pick up the phone and call them. It's also something that you can outline in your team contract. Another reason why people might not answer emails is a different orientation of time and how they define a sense of urgency. So for some people, if they define a sense of urgency as responding to emails within a week, then clearly you might feel like you're not getting a response. But if that's within their definition of sense of urgency, to them they might be being responsive. But if your definition of sense of urgency is responding within 24 hours or even within a workday, clearly that's very different. So that's another thing that you can do to work on people not answering emails, is to set those definitions of urgency up front.
Excellent. I see a question here that I'd like to respond to. How would you, from Richard, how would you look to best maximize your time with overseas colleagues when visiting to build face-to-face relationships? And this is going back to a best practice that we mentioned earlier and is also very apparent in our Trends in Global Virtual Teams survey report, which is to make a strong attempt to see your colleagues or your team at least once each year. And when you do visit them face-to-face, there are a few things that you can really do to cement a lasting interpersonal relationship. And one of them is to simply schedule time together where you're not under pressure to solve business problems or challenges, but really to simply get to know one another. And it really depends where you are and where your team is from when it comes to figuring out how much time you want to spend with them. If you're traveling to parts of Asia, you probably want to factor in most of your time with the team. Spending lots of time with them, going to dinner, having breakfast, having all the meals together is really going to demonstrate that you're truly interested in developing that trust, getting to know folks. And that really applies for a large portion of the world. I would say that in the West, in North America, in Western Europe, you probably do want to factor in some private time for folks to go away from the team to kind of decompress. It tends to be a little more important, I think, in the West to have that alone time to then regenerate the energy and kind of come back to the team with a fresh start. But of course, you do need to really analyze the cultural expectations around meetings face-to-face, how much time is expected to be allotted towards interpersonal activities, but always finding ways to do stuff together, whether it's taking a tour to a museum or simply spending time with team-building activities, having fun, meals. All of that, I think, is going to be very effective. But do keep in mind that with each country that you visit or with each culture that you're visiting with, there are certain kind of expectations around what is appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to meeting face-to-face. So I would advise you to look into Culture Wizard, for example, to explore our country profile database, to really understand what business meetings look like and how you can really, spend time talking. What is an appropriate conversation topic when you're, when you're in China versus Brazil, and study up on those so that you can make the biggest impact when you have time face-to-face. Thank you for the question, Richard.
Great, thanks, Sean. And there's a question coming in from John asking about recommendations for setting up a global team from scratch. His team is UK-based, and he's looking to employ new team members in Malaysia and possibly the US as well. John, this is always an exciting time when you're looking at setting up a team from scratch and you want to make sure that you're doing it as successfully as possible. So there are a couple of recommendations here. One of my favorite recommendations comes internally from one of my clients. When we were launching their Culture Wizard site, they gathered a team from the different regions around the world. It was a team of about 10 of us that were looking to launch Culture Wizard. And on our very first meeting, everyone submitted a PowerPoint that included a picture, which is something that we heard as a best practice earlier today. It also included a bit of background, so our role within the organization, how long we've been with the organization, what we did prior to joining the organization that we were currently with, and then also a fun fact. And these fun facts were great because it's something that you could strongly remember about the people on the team, and it was the perfect opportunity for small talk and building relationships prior to conference calls starting. So there was one woman on the team who was from Belgium, and her fun fact was that she loved chocolate and she loved coffee. And I, too, am a huge coffee fan. And so when we would be the first members on the call, we would always talk about the type of coffee that we were currently drinking that day. And so that was a really good way to start an initial team meeting with, it was about 45 minutes of the hour was going through the slides, learning about one another, building rapport, and then the last 15 minutes was focused on next steps. Okay, where do we go from here? So that's one recommendation I would make. And then the second recommendation, if you have the opportunity to start your team with that building high-performing teams exercise, I work with many clients that are forming new teams, especially when they're working with high potentials. And this is something that we've gotten great feedback on. So just that idea of when you're setting up an initial team, having a vision for success, then looking at potential things that could challenge that vision, and then deciding, okay, these are the guidelines. These are the ways that we're going to interact with each other to make sure that we overcome those challenges and realize the success will really set you up to be very high performing with your new team. So that's an exciting place to be.
All right, well, it looks like we've just come to the end of our hour together. So I would like to close our session by thanking everyone for your time and attention in joining us today. We do hope that you found our session valuable and inspiring, and that you'll move forward to move towards that high-performing state with your teams, both global and virtual. As always, we'll send a recording of today's webinar. It'll be at some point next week, along with a PDF of this presentation. And if you have any questions, please reach out to either of us. If you have a question about how to access Culture Wizard, if you know that you are an existing enterprise-wide client of Cultures, just send us an email. We'll be happy to help you with that. And we do hope that you'll join us in the new year for our next webinar. We'll be sending out a calendar of our webinars next month in December, announcing the first few months of 2015. Thank you, Grayson, for the wonderful presentation. And again, thanks to everyone else.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.